Hotep, greetings and welcome to Matters of Diversity with Dr. B. Today I have a very exciting show for you all today with the presidents of both our Republican and Democratic student organizations on campus. And without further ado, I'm just going to bring them on camera. So Hannah and Didi can come join me. Ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. So we'll start with you, Hannah. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what got you interested in your organization? And then we'll come over to you, Didi.
Sure. So my name is Hannah. I'm a junior political science major. I'm also studying economics and business here at UCF. So I got involved with College Democrats my freshman year. I had been a little bit politically active in my high school years, especially surrounding the 2016 election. So when I got to campus, I knew that I wanted to jump in, get involved with campaigns. It was a midterm election that year, so I was involved with Andrew Gillum's campaign for governor. And that I just wanted to make a community at UCF of people, like-minded individuals, where we could help out with our community and build connections that way. So that is why I joined College Democrats. But yeah.
Excellent, excellent. How about you, Didi?
And so my name is Didi Malka. I'm a junior here at UCF studying psychology on an industrial track with a minor in real estate, the plans to go to law school. Just like Hannah, I got involved my first year here. After a year of being involved with the College Republicans, I was elected vice chairman. We brought 2 big national speakers set to come to campus. And then after that, I was elected chairman, and that's kind of where I am now.
Nice, nice. So did you think when you were joining these organizations that you would be standing in the role that you are today as presidents of these organizations?
When I first got involved, I really was just trying to use College Democrats as a way to get more involved in my greater political community. So with campaigns, with our other representatives. So I don't know that I necessarily anticipated being in a leadership position, but after my first semester getting involved, my second year I served as the chief financial officer. So I very quickly realized that I wanted to be more involved with College Democrats and organizing on my on-campus, in my on-campus community.
Okay, good, good.
And for me, I would say in terms of the involvement, I definitely didn't see myself in this leadership position going into it, only because going into college, I wasn't very knowledgeable about politics at all. I was very ignorant in high school regarding politics. And it was only when I came to UCF that I decided that I wanted to educate myself. And through the past 3.5 years, I've learned a lot about just the local state of politics, a lot of really key issues that, we're discussing in our everyday conversations. And that really encouraged me and boosted me into these leadership positions, because I always saw opportunity within the College Republicans, and I always wanted to, claim to that and help, create a more comfortable space for conservative students on campus.
So that's a really good point that you make. So there's a lot of times that people have said or have been told, do not talk about politics on a college campus or in any environment. So talk about that a little bit. Why is it important to be able to talk about your identity as a person who understands and is involved with politics?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, I also study business and economics here at UCF. And in those courses and in those settings, it is very much taboo, and it's considered unprofessional to speak about politics. And it's so important to be able to, one of the founding rights that we have as Americans is our freedom of speech and expression. And it is so important to be able on campus and in any setting to be able to express your views. Politics is so personal. A lot of people like to think that they can just like not think about politics or that it doesn't affect them, but it really does, even if maybe they don't realize it. So it's super important to be able to express your views, also for it to be okay for your views to change. We're all young. Everyone at UCF is young. So being able to use your time, especially as an undergrad at UCF, to get involved with many different political organizations, to do your own research, to make your own opinions, and to know that it's okay for those opinions to like shift a little bit and to move around. Just because you said something a year ago doesn't mean you still have to agree. We're all growing. That's the point of college.
Right.
So being able to create a space like we have at College Democrats for learning and for discussion to help people figure out their views and what they believe is one of the great things that I'm glad we were able to facilitate in our organization.
Excellent, excellent. How about you, Didi?
And, I completely understand students who are either fearful or, very, are either scared or just don't really want to engage in politics, especially on a college campus, because I can tell you, I've only worn this hat a few times on campus and they weren't the best experiences. And so I understand.
Is that a MAGA hat?
That is, yes.
Okay.
And, I think that, the whole point, the whole goal of a university is to become not just engaged in what you're trying to study, but become engaged in the broader world. And you can't do that without understanding a basic sense of politics and government. And so I think that, especially on a university, there needs to be a sort of consensus on the fact that this space needs to be a place where we can have a dialogue and discuss and not shun out certain ideas or concepts. It really needs to be the one location we can, discuss these ideas and debate them, and I'm happy we've been able to do that, especially with the College Democrats. And, in terms of just the overall experiences, for students, I would argue that you should become civically engaged and you shouldn't be worried about, expressing your opinions, because like Hannah said, they can change and you're never going to learn. You're never going to, understand the other side or those who disagree with you without having that discussion. And the first step to having that discussion is coming out, with your ideas.
So I'll tell you that I think there's hope for the future, because one of the things that really excited me about you two is that you two have each other's telephone numbers, that you communicate with one another. And that shows really a sense of bipartisanship. And talk about that. Why is it important for you to be able to talk to each other and communicate with each other about these very important issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that we've really been able to like hone in on this year is that there are some things that are above partisanship. Like for example, we hosted an event with College Republicans and also with SGA to commemorate 9/11. And there are just certain things that, while we do disagree, some things are just American, and some things we can just come together on. And I'm glad that we've been able to facilitate that sort of relationship on campus. That's not something we see very often in terms of like our greater political arena. So I am glad we've been able to facilitate that on campus. Another example is just with voting. Everyone has the right to vote, and it's important that they're exercising that right, whatever they decide to vote for. So I'm glad that we've been able to come together and do some events like one that we have coming up later today, surrounding getting students out to vote, making sure that they have all the knowledge that they need in terms of how to vote, what they need to vote, getting registered, and also how to fill out their ballot, which candidates and campaigns they agree with. So I am glad that we've been able to work together with UCF GOP on that.
Nice. We'll talk a little bit more about where you're going to be heading to do that as we move forward. How about you, Didi?
So I really just want to echo what Hannah said, because she said it so well. Just the reason we need that relationship is to send the message that, our communities, while we may disagree on politics or the way we get to certain ideas or resolve certain issues, at the end of the day, we're all knights, we're all American, and we're all trying to solve the same issues. And so I think that message is something I really try to focus on, starting last year when I was only serving as vice chairman. Mm-hmm. Can you guys hear me? I feel like I'm cutting out just a bit.
No, we hear you very well.
Oh, okay. So even last year as vice chairman, one of my main priorities as vice chairman was to connect with the College Democrats, and we were able to host a debate with them. It was super civil. Student Government Gap hosted it. It was a really engaging opportunity for students to come and hear both sides in just a really civil, normalized manner, which we haven't seen too much of, in our presidential debates, unfortunately.
Can you all start running for Senate in the House of Republicans, House of Representatives? Can you do that soon enough? I mean, when are you going to be out there doing that for us?
Hopefully soon.
But yeah, I would just say for the most part, the main goal of work of bipartisanship is to send the message that there, like Hannah said, there are some things that are above politics. And if we don't ever acknowledge that, we're always going to be butting heads, and that should never be the goal.
Do you mind if I add something real quick just to that?
Sure.
Like we mentioned before, college is all about learning. It's all about expanding your horizons. And it can be a little daunting, especially for students who like maybe don't really want to be so politically involved or haven't been in the past, to show up to like a College Republicans or a College Democrats meeting. We sort of live as like super politically engaged people in this little bubble, and we don't always realize that it can be daunting to go into something like that as someone who maybe doesn't have a lot of knowledge. So when we're able to work together, it creates a space for students at our university to learn, to hear from both sides, and then to make an educated decision for themselves.
Very nice, very nice. So let's talk about this election cycle. As you pretty much noted, we have what, 4 days away? 4 days away from the actual election day. So what questions do you both think are critical for us to be asking with regards to this 2020 election?
Didi, you want to go first? I feel like I've been going first a lot. Didi, you want to take this one?
Sorry, you cut out. Can you repeat the question? I'm trying to like fix my.
So what questions do you think students should be having? What should we be asking? What should anybody be asking in general about that are critical to this 2020 election cycle?
Okay, Hannah, you go first because I'm having a little bit of issues and I'm going to try to figure it out.
Yeah. So I think going into this 2020 election cycle, it's really important for students to be thinking about how government impacts them and politics impacts them in ways that they might not realize. With this COVID pandemic, we've seen that not only are like president and federal officials, but going all the way down to your county commissioners, your state house and senate reps, those people have a major impact on your life. We see this like trend in elections where people vote for the top office. So like they'll vote for president and then they leave the rest of the ballot blank. So it's really important in this election for UCF students and for voters in general to be focusing on those down ballot races, because while the president and federal officials, like they have big ideas and they can affect change in who the president and your like U.S. House and Senate representatives are, those people do matter. And it is important to make an educated decision on who you're going to vote for. But your state and local officials are just as important. And in reality, they can have a bigger impact on your daily life than those federal officials can. People like your school board representatives, if your city has like a commission or a city council, your county commission, your like Tallahassee representatives, those people can have a major, major impact on your life. So much of the way our government is set up, it leaves so much power to the states. And so it's important to know who's representing you. So I think that's like something we've really been focusing on with College Democrats this semester, is making sure that students are educated on those down ballot races and voting the entire ballot. Additionally, there are 6 state amendments that are on the ballot this cycle, and then there are a couple Orange County ones as well. But those amendments are all really important, knowing what those are. It can be daunting when you're looking at your ballot. There's a lot on there, and it's really complicated, and it's written that way for a reason, but it's definitely important to know what you're voting for and to use your entire voice and not simply stop after the first race.
So how do you find out that information? So I understand what you're talking about with regards to this, but one of the things that I always find myself in the challenge of is understanding who the judges are, right? I can get all the other information. I get placards and text messages and all those other things from different candidates telling me about who they are or why they're opposing the other person. But can you talk a little bit about how do you get to the down ballot for those individuals who are just not as, visible as some of the others?
Yeah, one thing that we see students struggling with a lot and voters in general is judges, because they are nonpartisan. So even if somebody knows that like they're a Democrat or they're a Republican, those judges are nonpartisan. And because they don't really campaign, that's like not really the purpose of judges. Sometimes they won't even have a website for you to be able to go to. Even if they do, it may not have a platform on there because that's not the point of judges. They're not meant to have a platform. And really, the only way to figure out who that judge is to look at their voting record, not voting record, to look at like the cases that they've tried in the past, which is a lot of work. I'm not going to tell you that it's not. It takes a lot of time and a lot of research. And that is something that we try to combat as college Democrats. We go through all of that information and try to make an educated recommendation to our members, because the fact of the matter is, while it would be fantastic for everyone to get their ballot, to research every single candidate, every single judge, every single amendment, that just isn't the reality. People just don't have the time or the willpower to do that. So we've tried to do that to make our recommendations. But in terms of candidates, the best place that I would say to get information would be on the candidates' websites. Anytime you go to like anyone's endorsement or try to find like a third party talking about a candidate, you're going to get some bias.
Okay.
So the best way I would say to go about that would be to look at each candidate's website, read through their platform, and make a decision from there.
And I think my Wi-Fi is good now. So to answer your original question, I believe, the importance of the state and local elections, especially with what we focused on, is actually hearing from them, because you're going to hear, President Trump and Vice President Biden speak every single day. You're going to know their opinions on everything, but you're less likely to know about those down ballot candidates. And so we've focused on bringing as many as we can to our meetings. And so we have a meeting every single week, Tuesdays at 7 via Zoom. And so at nearly every single one we've had this semester, we've had someone running for either a state Senate seat, House seat, or anything like that, to come in and actually speak to our members. And that allows our members to hear from the candidates, hear what they're focusing on legislation wise. And then it also puts their name on their radar, maybe prompting them to do some further research. Who are they running against? Why are they running? And how does this impact me? And so we think the priority when getting students to get involved in the state and local elections is to put those candidates in front of them, to give them the opportunity and the platform to voice their opinions.
So, quick question. What is the purpose behind these placards that we get in the mail that don't showcase which party the person's running are on? Do you ever notice that? And what do you think are the reasons behind that?
I notice that a lot. And so it's also something you might notice when you see the signs on your way to the precincts. A lot of those signs that are planted in the ground will just say their name, what they're running for, and not if they're Republican or Democrat. And while I'm not 100% knowledgeable on like the exact reason why, so that's just the preface, I always had this idea that if you're going into a precinct and you're ready to vote, you most likely know who you're voting for. And so those signs and those things in the mail are most likely to just get the name in your head. As a psychology student, I can tell you it's really useful to just keep showing you the same thing over and over again, so that when you actually show up and you see the ballot in front of you, you have no idea what these local and state races are about, but you've seen that name like 100 times. And so you're just going to fill it in because that's what you've seen. And so I think there's a little bit of that involved in terms of the psychology of voters who aren't as well informed. But Hannah, what do you think?
Yeah, Didi's pretty much got it. Essentially, the idea behind all of the mailers that you get and also the signs that you see on the side of the road, in people's front yards, at polling locations. So for things like that, when it comes to like your bigger races like Trump and Biden, those signs aren't really super effective. Nobody is voting for Trump because they like saw some sign on the side of the road. And same thing with Biden. Like Didi said, we all know where they stand. For the most part, there are, not that there aren't undecided voters, there are, but they're not making their decision based off the signs that they see on the side of the road. Those signs are most effective and most used when it comes to your down ballot races and, most importantly, your nonpartisan races. A lot of not so informed voters will just vote a straight party ticket. They know I agree with Democrats or I agree with Republicans, and then they'll just vote that party all the way down the ticket. Then when they get to those nonpartisan elections, like Didi said, it's all about name recognition. if you're looking at a list of 10 names and you recognize one because your neighbor had a sign in their lawn, or you drove past the same sign every single day, or you saw a group of people standing outside your polling location waving a sign for that person, although you have no idea who they are and you have no idea who their opponents are, you feel like you do. You feel like you know them because of name recognition. So that is where those signs are most effective, and that is why you get so many mailers specifically for those down ballot candidates.
So is there a time when too much is too much? You know, you get one in your mail from each candidate every day. Is there a time when you say, is that the best use of the money that I'm donating to help your campaign?
A lot of people feel that way, especially in terms of text and phone banking. They feel like they get bombarded with texts or calls or even mailers from a certain campaign or a certain candidate. I would say there's probably a point where too much is too much. Another main impact of, specifically, like if you see people on the side of the road like waving signs, that sort of stuff, and even like people, like if you see your neighbors having signs in their lawn, another big implication of that is it makes you feel like you're not out of place. So like a lot of people, if they feel like, oh, I live in a red area but I support Biden, maybe I'm the only one, and then they see their neighbor with a Biden sign in the yard, then they feel like they're not the only one, and they may be more likely to volunteer or to go to one of those like sign waving things. And it works the same way if you feel like you live in a really blue area but you're a Trump supporter, and then you see that your neighbor is as well. It's a sense of community, and community is extremely important in political organizing. That is where your volunteers come from. That's where like your big voter base comes from. It's all about community and building community. You don't get that so much when you get things in the mail. I'm not, honestly, I don't have like the statistics. I don't know how effective those things are. And I do know that especially with people who are not super politically active, they do get overwhelmed by the amount of mailers, text calls that they get. But there also is a reason that, especially with texting and phone banking, there's a reason that campaigns are sending those out. They're trying to figure out how much support that they have.
Right.
As someone who used to do that, I used to be the person that's calling you and you were like screaming at me. That used to be me, and still is. And the reason that they do that is to try to figure out where their support is, try to get as many volunteers like scheduled for shifts as possible. So there is a reason behind it, but I can understand that it can get overwhelming.
So I'll ask you this question in terms of the negativity that is sometimes seen in some of these placards against the opposing party or the person that they're running against. How effective do you think that is? And do you think that it can sometimes backfire on the political candidate?
I would personally say it depends on how they're attacking. I think there's a group of people that like to see it because it demonstrates they're putting in effort. They're trying to, not only showcase their policies, but trying to get you to not like the opponents, so that even if you're not so with the Republican or the Democrat, it's more so your hate for the other candidate. And we also see that now with the settle for Biden, camp, and the fact that I personally feel that there are more people who dislike Donald Trump than like Joe Biden that are voting for him. And so I think that's a big point of a lot of these campaigns and their attack methods. It's to get you to dislike the opponent if they can't get you to like them. And sometimes it's not effective. I know many people who dislike that strategy. I personally am not a big fan of it. I think it's just sort of just like, I don't know, it just doesn't feel very, very like nice. I remember recently there was a campaign where both the Democrat and the Republican in one of the races in another state did a video campaign together and said,
Yes.
We're running against each other, but we're good.
California, it was Utah or California, one of the two.
Yeah, one of the two. And I find that to be a lot more effective, but I do understand why they do that. And then there's also the idea of effort, to the point where, back to your original question of is this a good use of money spending? I would argue that if they weren't spending those money on what we find, meticulous or not so necessary, without that, you would see maybe a discrimination in effort. And so one person who's at home who is getting like 20 things about different Democrats and got nothing about Republicans in the mail are saying, wow, Democrats are putting a lot more effort in, I don't see the Republicans sending me anything, what's going on there? And you plant that seed of doubt. It can be the same thing on the other way around. You get 20 Republican things and not one Democrat, and people are like, why aren't they, trying? And so I think there's also that.
Also, I wonder though, is if people are saying, or do you feel that people sometimes say that it's a waste of resources and that, you know, you have some children that are in different districts that are starving and maybe not getting food and things along those lines, and money could be used for something different? Could there be a way of utilizing this money that is coming in to showcase what you do and what you stand for, as opposed to sometimes putting out negative advertisement? And the reason why I ask that question is sometimes the advertisements are not truthful. And so what do you think about that as well? Like if there's things that are in there that kind of slant to something that's not necessarily true, but it gets out there and it sends a message.
Right. So political ads, like Didi said, especially negative ones, they do have a place in politics. And the reason that some people find them to be so important is that you should absolutely be showcasing what's great about your candidate, whoever that is. There absolutely should be money spent on advertisements that talk about that candidate's platform, the great things that that candidate, ideas that they have, what they're going to do for the community. But it's also important for them to point out the downfalls of the other candidate. While it's nice for us to all be friends all the time, at the end of the day, that just isn't the reality. And when you have candidates and politicians who are attacking the rights of marginalized communities, that needs to be pointed out. And there is a place for that in politics. And in terms of the mailers specifically, sometimes they can be like, some of the pictures on there, like kind of funny and like kind of like they put weird filters on them. They do that to get your attention. A lot of the times you're going through the mail, you just throw that stuff out. But if there's like a picture on there or a font or a color that like piques your interest or catches your eye, you're more likely to look at it. So that is why sometimes it feels like maybe they're going a little bit overboard, specifically with those mailers. It's for that reason. It's to get your attention. So it's important to have both. A campaign is not going to be successful if all they're ever doing is attacking the other candidate or the other party. That just isn't going to be successful. Like Didi mentioned, there are a lot of times in politics, you do see like people voting for a candidate because they don't like the other candidate. And it's like a lesser of two evils kind of situation. And that can be really frustrating for voters, but you're never going to agree 100% with pretty much any politician. You're going to be hard pressed to find any candidate of either party, even the like third party independent. It's very unlikely that you will find a candidate that agrees with your views and you feel represents you 100%. And that can be really frustrating for people. And I completely understand that. But what's important is just to find the one that fits you the best, even if you don't agree with everything that they do. And then once they get elected, to work with community organization like offices and organizations to push them towards and make sure that they know where you don't agree with them and push them towards your ideology and your point of view.
Well, that's such a very important point. Didi, you know, it's important to vote, but it's what happens after you vote. And so what do you think people should do with regards to keeping their politicians honest?
Well, I think the first point is that the politics don't end after November 3rd, right? There's going to be Senate in session. We're going to have a different looking Senate, House, I mean, even Supreme Court. And so when the legislation begins after that period, the problems don't just disappear, right? COVID isn't going to disappear after the election as much as we would want it to. So there's a lot of things that we need to consider, and I would encourage those who are getting civically engaged now to continue that effort and not to get comfortable, because regardless of the outcome of the election, there's always going to be more work to be done on both sides. And as soon as you become complacent with either the election result, either because your candidate got in or because they didn't and you sort of want to give up, that's sort of when you give your opponent the upper edge. And I think continuing to try and fix the issues that the person you want to vote for was trying to fix is still ongoing. That effort doesn't end after the November 3rd date. And I also would argue that while we want to encourage people to vote, I think it's more important to have an informed vote. And so I see all the people just saying vote, vote, vote. But if you're seeing that, you know nothing about politics, but your roommate is like voting for Biden or Trump, and you're just going to go with that, I don't think that's very productive. And so I would encourage people to have an informed vote and maybe do some research before they decide they're going to vote just because their favorite celebrity is telling them to. Yeah.
Very nice, very nice. So how can we make sure that everyone's voice is heard in November? What do you all give as advice for those to make their voices heard?
Sure. So in Florida, we have a lot of instances of voter suppression. It's like not super uncommon in Florida. We see things that are like blatant voter suppression and also things that aren't. Like, for example, at the early voting location on campus, the wait times can be like an hour or even more. We have some early voting locations in Orange County where the wait times have peaked at around 3 hours. That is, in a sense, a form of voter suppression. Most people do not have 3 hours out of their day to go stand in the sun and wait to vote, and people just aren't going to do that. Additionally, like the issues that we've had recently with mail ballots and the United States Postal Service, it's an issue in Florida, and making sure that people know their rights is really important. It's going to be super, super important, especially for those who are waiting to vote on election day, which I would not recommend. Please vote early or go drop off your mail ballot. But if you are going to be voting on election day, it's so important to know your rights. It's important to know that if the polling location closes at 7 p.m. and you were in line by 7 p.m., you get to vote. Don't let the people tell you that you're not allowed to vote, that it's closed. If you were there by 7 p.m., you are allowed to vote. So making sure that people know their rights. We also have UCF students and also just like other community organizers will be at those polling locations and have been since early voting started, making they know the voters' rights and making sure that the voters know their own rights, so that we're getting as many people to vote as possible, and that nobody is facing any sort of voter suppression. There's like a voter protection hotline that you can call if you feel like you've been a victim of voter suppression or anything like that. So yeah, in terms of getting people's voices heard, it's just making sure that they're able to vote, that everyone who is eligible to vote is able to vote. And then in terms of past November 3rd, focusing on, like Didi said, politics does not end when the election is over. Like I said, you're not going to be hard pressed to find a candidate that you agree with 100%. So even if the candidate that you favored gets in office, that doesn't mean that it's over. You still need to be fighting for your ideals, for the issues that are important to you. And the next election is just 2 years away, which might seem pretty far, but in campaign terms, it's really not. So it'll be here before we know it, and making sure that we're continuing to stay involved and that students know. It's really important for college Democrats, for students to know that we're still here, we're still active, having events, speaking to our representatives, going over current events, staying informed even when an election isn't happening.
Very nice. So at some point, I'd like to get that number for the voter suppression. If you can say it out, that would be great.
Yeah, let me look it up and make sure I have the right one.
So Didi, why is it that students vote and that they matter? What is it about the student vote that matters, and what should politicians be looking for from a student?
Well, I think the cliche answer is that we're going to inherit, this economy, this world, this country once the older generation leaves. And so that's why it's more important. But I would say the more nuanced answer, and the answer I tend to give people of why students and younger people should get involved, is because the actual policies and the people that you're electing matter now, not just in the future. Like, they will affect you now. And so if you're 18 and ready to vote, you're already in a position in which you're about to, go out into the real world and start dealing with a lot of these issues. And so if you don't get involved now, and if you don't start to at least give yourself the background on the political environment, when you do get a job and you do, settle in, you're going to be a step back, because you're no longer in a position to balance everything, plus catch up on everything you've missed. And so I think now, as a student, as someone who might have more leeway and time to get involved with clubs like ours or Hannah's, now is a good time for you to start to get that background, so that even if you don't show up to every meeting or you're not as engaged, you're at least giving yourself some of that nuanced information, so that later on down the line you can make an informed decision. Because if you wait until you're in your late 20s to start getting involved, you're going to realize that there's a lot to catch up on. There's a lot you might not understand. And so giving yourself that background now is going to help you make an informed decision for the rest of your life.
So do you have members that are in both parties, or do you have members who at least go to your meetings who come from the other party just to hear the other side of the equation?
We have had instances of that before. We have had members from Specifically, we've gotten a lot of, for whatever reason, members from the Libertarian Party coming to our events and coming to our meetings. Correct me if I'm wrong, Didi, I do not think that there is a college for libertarians at UCF. So maybe it's just because they feel like they don't really have anywhere else to go. So they're trying to figure out where they fit in best. We have had instances of that. We've also had events like the debate that we had last year that were meant to be members from both organizations. So it does happen. I will say that it's rare that we see members from
people in both
other
parties,
parties.
both sides.
And I would speak to my organization. It's very similar to what Hannah said. Like, we don't see it as much, but even just at our last meeting earlier this week on Tuesday, we had someone who said that, you know, they were a Democrat. They were full liberal, and they came in and just wanted to ask some questions. And we were in the middle of something, so I told them, if you want to wait till the end, a lot of our members would love to talk with you. And after our meeting ended, I saw that there was a 30-minute conversation between this Democrat and our Republican members. And so we really encourage that conversation. And I know for our organization, and I'm sure for Hannah's, that we're not going to not let you become a member if you're not a Democrat or a conservative. And so we really love having that discussion, that debate. That's really what it's all about. And so we're always trying to find students who lean more liberally or lean more as Democrats, who are looking to understand why we have our positions and explain that to them. And most of them walk away continuing to stay Democrats or liberals, but now they have a better understanding of our positions, and that's the goal.
Cool. Didi, there's a question in the chat for you. I'm going to ask you, do you think the character and honesty matter in a candidate?
Yeah, of course, character and honesty matters in a candidate. And I absolutely know you're talking about Trump. And so, I think the distinction there is the fact that when we were going into 2016, you know, there were in the primaries, I was like, oh, I think, you know, this person would be good, this person would be good. And Donald Trump ended up being that candidate. And I knew going into it that, you know, maybe he wasn't going to be so conservative as I would like him to. You know, he's also going to speak his mind, which I know a lot of people like and some people dislike, you know. But going into it, I knew that character was going to be an issue. But I think for the most part, what I've realized is he's leaned a lot more conservatively and Republican on a lot of issues that I thought he wouldn't. I thought he was going to come into it with a very populist mindset. And so I'm really happy with a lot of the conservative and Republican decisions he's made. And so it's just really funny to me that, like, every day Trump will say another like crazy thing, and the media will just be like, did you hear what Trump said? As if like he doesn't say something crazy every single day. So like this is just something like we have now. It's something we live with. And while, yeah, I think it would be great to have the best of both worlds, someone who's, you know, spoke their mind, was a conservative, was Republican, and didn't have, you know, the type of rhetoric that Trump has. It's not that perfect world. And for me, I'm going to prioritize the policies and the legislation more so than the character. And I'm sad that that's even a sacrifice we have to make, but that is a priority of mine. It's to make sure that there's, you know, conservative and Republican ideologies maintained in our system. And so that's my goal.
So that's a good question for both of you. Would you vote for a major party candidate outside of your party affiliation if you felt the other person was a better candidate?
Like, would I vote for a Republican if I felt they were a better candidate? Is that the question? I'm not going to say that I wouldn't consider it, but given the candidates that we see being put up by the Republican Party and the shift in the past couple of years to be even more conservative than they even were in the past, even just 20 years ago, a lot of people felt that voting was not important because Democrats and Republicans were essentially the same. And if you look at voting records and if you look at platforms, they were kind of right. Obviously, there have always been differences in the parties, but they were very, very similar. Nowadays, I don't feel that is the case. I feel that the parties are like complete opposites from each other. Maybe
down ballot?
Pretty much, yes. Maybe there are some, especially with since the election of President Trump, I feel that has become even more true. That we see, like, even in like with the recent vote, the confirmation of Justice Barrett, that was a party line vote. There was not a single Democrat who voted to confirm her, and not a single Republican who voted to not. And so I don't know that right now there is not a Republican on my ballot that I would consider voting for. I don't want to say like definitively that I would never consider it.
It was more a futuristic question than what's happening right now. But,
Right. I mean, I pride myself on making an informed vote. So I'm always going to look into my candidates. And so if I felt that there was maybe a non-Democratic candidate that was better than the Democratic candidate, I would definitely consider that. I don't just blindly vote for all Democratic candidates, but I don't.
That's what my question was about in terms of that. How about you, Didi?
Yeah, I would never rule out the possibility of voting for a Democrat. You know, I'm still very young. There's still a lot I'm learning about. And while right now, like Hannah said, but for the opposite, a lot of the conservatives and a lot of the Republicans on the ballot align very closely with my values and what I deem, you know, better for our country. That's not to say that in 2, 4, 6, 8 years, there won't be a Democrat who I agree with more and Republicans who I don't. And again, similar to what Hannah said, but for the opposite, I see, you know, the Democrats sort of leaning more towards a far left agenda, especially with new Congress people like Ilhan Omar and AOC, and that worries me. And so if they were not to get as close as that, maybe I would consider it more, but I would never rule out the possibility of voting for someone who isn't a Republican because I'm not a blind voter.
So the both of you have just said that there are people who are polarizing and things along those lines. Can you talk a little bit more about what the policies are that these people uphold that you're against, as opposed to the person? Because that's what seems to be the argument a lot of times, is that, oh, I'm opposing this person or opposing that person, but we don't hear what you're opposing per se. Is there anything in particular that you're opposing that would make you not vote for a person or see a person as a good candidate?
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely a lot. Like I said, there's not much about Trump that I would say that I agree with. But what's most important, I would say, to mention is equal rights. I'm happy to discuss politics, to, you know, I don't want to say argue, but to have discussions with people who don't agree with me on political ideas, things
Right.
like tax rates, things like zoning laws, things like the best way to use a budget, things like what should be left to the federal government and what should be left to the states. But things like the rights of LGBTQ plus Americans, the things like the safety of our Black Americans and other Americans of color, those are just not things that I'm willing to debate. I am personally of the belief that we are all equal, that everybody deserves to have equal rights, equal protections under law. And that is just not something I see coming from the opposing party. If they were willing to maybe change their views on that, then maybe I would consider it. But at this point, I am absolutely not willing to vote for any candidate who can't come out and say definitively that they support LGBTQ plus, their LGBTQ plus constituents and Americans, their constituents of color. Equal rights is extremely, extremely important to me. Additionally, environmental policy is just something that's really important to me. And so seeing that we have representation in our government that blindly just don't believe that climate change is real or don't believe that it's a real threat is very scary to me as a young person. And we see that a lot on campus, people worrying about climate change and having that be one of their most important issues. We have a lot of environmental groups on campus, even ones that like aren't maybe necessarily political. We see a lot of environmental groups. And I think that that isn't just the UCF thing, that's like across the board, young people care about climate change because this is our planet and we're inheriting it and it has a lot of issues, but we need somewhere to live. We need an inhabitable planet. So that's another issue that's extremely important to me. But yeah, I'm willing to debate politics. I really am. And I'm open to hearing opposing views, to discussing my own views. But it's not like things like equal rights are just not political. So.
Okay. And so when you see suppression of vote, that also is something that kind of bothers you.
Absolutely, yeah. It's not the like straight white men that are getting their votes oppressed. It's the community, the minority communities and the already oppressed communities that see voter suppression more often.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that is definitely a symptom of that system.
What are your thoughts, Didi?
Yeah, similarly, there's a ton of issues that are non-negotiable for me. Things like pro-life, things like our Second Amendment rights, especially with someone who has ancestors who survived the Holocaust. My right to bear arms is something I take very seriously and something I never, I'm very serious about. And then there are policies that I think, we can discuss, like Hannah was saying. But I would also argue that there are a lot of issues that I think are mischaracterized, especially about Republicans. I know Hannah and I have spoken about the fact that our organization believes that climate change is an issue. It's man-made. We just have different ways of resolving that. We think there's a more economically friendly and capitalist way of solving these issues rather than government. And they believe that that government might be better. And so I think I agree with her that there are some things that are non-negotiable. And they're different for each of us. And, when it comes to something like, equality for different communities, like I think most Republicans are on board with that. I think that's somewhat of a mischaracterization of a lot of Republicans.
How did
And
it get so twisted, you think?
what was that?
How did it get so twisted? If that is how they stand, how do you think their messaging got co-opted?
Oh, it's 100% the media. It's always the media. And I want to be very careful in my wording here. It's not so much that the media is presenting the information, because if that were the case, there wouldn't be a lot of these issues. It's more so the fact that the media does have bias, because as I always tell people, if you're working in the media and you're working with politics, the only way you got there is because you already know about politics and you already have your implicit bias in terms of what you find right and wrong. And so if you're gonna, talk about politics in the media, you've already set up your mind. And so I think that's a big reason why a lot of these ideas get misconstrued. But I would also say it's the result of just the rivalry between the two parties. Republicans are going to want to mischaracterize a lot of what the Democrats say. Democrats are going to want to mischaracterize what Republicans say to bring more people to their base. And on both sides, I think that's an issue. I don't think that's a one party issue. I think that's an issue on both parties, and something I would like to see resolved, and something I'm very happy that me and Hannah have been able to do together, which is to work together rather than butting heads on everything. And so I think a big reason why we tend to look at the opposite party as being, just terrible, both Republican and Democrat, it's just being terrible and not understanding, and a lot of these things that we can't imagine ever, coming to base on. I think that if you actually sit down and speak to someone of the opposite party, if you actually sit down and speak to a Democrat or speak to a Republican, you're going to find that you agree on a lot more than you think you do. Even members in Hannah's executive board, I've been able to speak with, and we agree on more things than we thought we would. Right. And I think that the message there is that, again, we tend to have the same goals. We just have vastly different ways of getting to them.
Well, we need people like you all in the actual offices that bring this type of mentality to the issue, because I think that it's gotten lost. Right? We have people who are have these positions, but they actually do not do what you're talking about doing. You hear so much about people going across the aisle and working with others. You're not hearing it as much anymore as you have heard in the past. And so we have to see a way to get back to that. So Hannah, I have a quick question for you. There's a couple of questions that are coming in through the chat. I have some other questions I want to ask you all as well. But the question is, there are a lot of people who are in particular neighborhoods that are Republicans, but they're voting for Biden. Have you seen a lot of that on campus?
Yes, actually, we have seen a lot of that on campus, specifically because we're dealing with young people. We have a lot of students who are independent or NPA voters. They feel that they don't know enough to register with the Democrats or with the Republican Party, and that's totally okay. We've seen a lot of those people who have said, a lot of students are first-time voters, but for those that aren't, who have said maybe they come from a Republican family, they felt that they were Republican. Our own vice president is a former Republican. And he is now obviously the vice president of College Democrats, but that is extremely common across the nation. Every living president supports Joe Biden, even the Republicans. And even a lot of Republican officials and past representatives, senators, House reps, that sort of stuff, a lot of them, not like a majority or anything, but there are a lot of prominent Republicans that are supporting Joe Biden in this election. And I think there are a lot of different reasons for that. But like I said, there's been a shift recently in the Republican Party, in both parties, but specifically speaking about the Republican Party, and a lot of Republicans who were a part of, that old party aren't maybe so happy with that. And so they find themselves more aligning with the Democrats nowadays. So I think that's why we see a lot of that. Additionally, for better or for worse, I guess, Donald Trump is not the kind of president we have ever had before. A lot has happened in the past 4 years that nobody could have ever predicted, but nobody saw coming. And I think that.
But it's not about the person so much as it is about the politics of the day, right? And so,
right. And at the end of the day, like Didi was talking about, like if you speak, like if I were to, when I speak to Didi, or like if a Republican voter were to speak to a Democratic voter, they're going to realize that they have a lot more in common than maybe they thought. Right. And that may be true, but in terms of voting, we have to focus on the facts and what's actually being done, looking at the past 4+ years, seeing what the Trump administration has, the policies that they put in place, the legislation that they have, spearheaded and that sort of stuff, that is what's most important. So
that's the most important point.
Right. So although like I may find Republican voters that maybe I don't realize how much I agree with them, the fact that I'm not voting for them. I'm not voting for the Republican base. And I think that that's something we see a lot in voters, is that they don't like Trump supporters, so they're not going to vote for Trump, or they don't like Biden supporters, so they're not going to vote for Biden. That's not who you're voting for. Like, I'm sorry that like you felt like turned off or whatever by the Biden supporters, but you're not voting for the supporters. You're not voting for the Democratic voters, the Republican voters. You're voting for the politician. And so it's important to look at their past and to focus on that. And, you also, with politicians, like I said, you have to look at the facts. You have to take everything that comes out of their mouth, especially when they're in front of cameras, with a grain of salt, and make sure that they're backing that up with the legislation that they're championing. It's very, very, very easy to get in front of a camera and say that you support one thing or another. But then when you turn your back and are legislating against what you said, that's what matters, not not the like soundbite. So
Didi, what's your thoughts on the Lincoln Project?
Not a fan.
You're a fan?
Not a fan.
Not a fan. Okay.
Not a fan. I think the real issue with the Lincoln Project is more so about education for me, and how we implement politics into our education system. Because obviously we have a public funded education system, and so you want to keep politics as much as you can out of it, because you want to allow students to just learn the facts and what happened, and not allow politics to seep into that, because kids are obviously very malleable. And so as soon as you start, a certain agenda or a certain viewpoint, again, whether it's Republican or Democrat, I think that's just very unhealthy for a lot of students. And while I think that it's fine that teachers can express their opinion and create their schedule and work to, mimic the values they find important, I also find there to be an emphasis on the fact that we also need to make sure that the actual content that we're presenting to students is non-biased. And I don't see that with the Lincoln Project. I also don't see that with, the opposite, when PragerU is introduced into the classroom. While I like PragerU, I also don't think it should be introduced into the classroom as, a funded way of educating students, because they're both partisan organizations. And I think that it's a lot more important that students learn history and facts rather than learning partisan values and ideas that are only going to, I don't know. I just don't think that's just a very healthy way of educating our children.
I completely agree that I think it's so important that, especially like our public schools are government funded, and they need to be, it needs to be an all-encompassing education. It's not doing anybody any favors to have that public education be skewed. That being said, it's more than just of like not allowing teachers to come in and say that they are Republicans or Democrats. It's more than that. It's also about the content that's being taught and ensuring that it's all encompassing, because it's also biased to just leave certain things out. It's a harder bias to pinpoint and to realize, but that is also a form of bias and is also a disservice to our students. So making sure that the curriculum is all encompassing, is including the entire story, is very, very important, especially in that K-12 education, but in college as well.
Great, thanks. So Didi, in the question and answer, there's this question for you about pro-life. It says that you are a pro-life advocate. How do you feel about Trump not being honest about the pandemic? And now we've lost nearly 10 times the cases and deaths of any other country. What are your thoughts regardless?
I would say the two have nothing to do with each other, quite honestly. It's a, that connection is very similar to what you know how people will say, oh, they say Black Lives Matter, but they're not, funding, Black schools, or they're not helping Black businesses. And the answer to that is Black Lives Matter is focused on police brutality and not all that other stuff. And I would say the same thing. Being pro-life is focused on, saving the unborn and being anti-abortion, and not about the pandemic. They're just not related.
So
And
let me
so
ask you a quick question with that. So in the same token, if you were to bring in Black Lives Matter, right? If you have the pro-life, is it pro-life just for babies in conception, or is it pro-life for all individuals, regardless of what their age is?
Well, the pro-life movement is about abortion. That's what it's about, right? Like the name is pro-life, so if you aren't aware about it, it sounds like maybe something else. But it's about abortion. It's about helping to stop abortions nationwide. It's about stopping, educating. It's just about saving life before the baby is born. And then it's the reason I brought up Black Lives Matter is because I know a lot of my fellow Republicans tend to conflate the two ideas and say, well, they're saying Black Lives Matter, but they don't care about all this stuff. And the answer to that is they're focused on one issue, right? And I'm sure they would address the other issues as I would address homelessness and other issues that are happening, regarding life, quality of life. Like those are things I'm willing to address. But when I say pro life, I'm focused on one issue. Similarly to when people say Black Lives Matter, they're focused on one issue.
Well, I think we need to have a conversation about that. I think that would be a nice, we bring people back and talk about that, because I'm not sure that Black Lives Matter is just about one issue as opposed
Right.
to.
I think one thing that we see in the Democratic Party and with liberal advocates is the importance of intersectionality. Each issue is connected to a different issue. The pro-choice movement and women's right to choose and their right over bodily autonomy is about more than abortion and their choice to do whatever they and their doctor think is right with that pregnancy. Every issue is connected. Black Lives Matter, yes, it started with police brutality, and it is about police brutality, and that is extremely important. But it's also about systemic racism, which is about more than police brutality, because it's throughout our entire system. It is about supporting Black businesses. It is about investing in the Black community. Just like the pro-choice movement is about more than pregnancy. It's about equality, access to healthcare, access to the resources, access to contraception. And it is more saying that the pro-life movement ends at birth. That's a disservice. I don't understand, but I
think you just gave me a great idea for
benefit.
another show. I'll have to have both of you all come back and talk about that in more depth. I want to ask you all a final question, because we're coming up on the end of the hour. And the question I have for you is, what happens after the election? Regardless of what happens on November 4th, we're either going to have a new candidate or a return of what's in the White House right now, or we don't have any answers, because there might still be kind of votes being counted and coming in. So as young people who are, in this to win this, what are you going to do, or how do you unify people regardless of how the outcome of the election is? What do you want to see happen on November 4th?
I think it's going to be extremely important for people to realize that, unfortunately, the chances of us having a decision and a victor on the night of November 3rd or November 4th is extremely unlikely, given the increased number of mail-in ballots and how close this election will probably be, specifically in Florida. The chances of us having a winner on November 4th, I would say, are relatively low. So what's going to be important is not allowing either candidate or either party to claim victory before they have won, ensuring that every single ballot is counted, specifically those mail-in ballots, making sure that those get counted. That is like a reliable way to vote. That is like a legitimate way to vote. And those votes count just as much as the ones that are cast in person. So ensuring that there is enough manpower to count those votes as quickly as possible. If there are any issues, going back and recounting. And we're going to see that especially in Florida. Florida's had issues with that before. And it's always a state that goes by a very small margin. So like every single vote really does make a difference. But at some point, somebody will win, and we will have our next president. Regardless of who that is, it's going to be very important for each party to, first of all, take a couple days off, take a deep breath, congratulate themselves for everything that they have done, because campaigning is extremely hard work and it is extremely taxing on its organizers. So that's step number one. And then after that, it's going to be figuring out all of the issues that we want addressed, the order in which we want them addressed, and the best way to do that. So speaking to your local officials, whoever from your party, and even those that aren't from your party that were elected, speaking to them to make sure they know where you as their constituents stand, and what the issues that you want addressed and how you want them addressed, and ramping it back up for 4 years of president whoever, and how to best address that. There are also some issues that, while politics and electoral politics and politicians are helpful, they can't always be solved that way, and that an investment in community organizations is more important. So focusing on those things as well.
How about you, Didi?
I would say the most important thing is holding the elected officials you voted for accountable for what they campaigned with, because regardless of if you're Democrat or Republican, someone that you voted for is going to win, whether it's somewhere in the state or local or presidential election. It's not going to be all Republicans, not going to be all Democrats. So someone you voted for will win. And so the next step is to hold them accountable for the things they campaigned on, because we see a lot of, politicians are known for breaking their campaign promises. And so I think the most important part is to say, okay, we elected you. Now, are you going to say what you promised us, and how are you going to do it? Because the legislation is going to start right away. And without us holding them accountable, some politicians like to get very comfortable and lazy. They push things around without actually achieving anything. And so I think it's on us as the electors to make sure that whoever is in certain positions of power are doing what they promised to do. And I think that's the most important thing post-election.
Absolutely.
I want to thank both of you all for coming and talking and sharing, and also just being the bright lights that you are to showcase that we can do this. We can have these conversations. We can talk about politics in a very civil and in a way in which we can kind of move the narrative forward, right? And so I really appreciate the both of you for coming and having this conversation. I would love to invite you back to get into a deeper details about the other things that we weren't able to talk about. The things that I would love to talk to you all about is, there's this idea of court packing and what is happening along those lines. And, you brought up Black Lives Matter and pro-life and all these things. And this is what this platform is really going to be about, is us as students and understanding what's out there and what we want to do when it comes to climate change or any of those other things. So I appreciate you all so much. For the viewing folks, next week's our show is going to be with counselors. I'm going to have on Wednesday counselors just to talk about where people are after the election has kind of passed by. Now, we may not know who the candidate who wins are on some of these races, but we're going to have some people there talking about how to cope with, regardless of whether someone's won or lost in your particular party affiliations. And on Friday, we're going to have students from the counselor education program here on our campus who are just going to talk about it from a student perspective. And so look forward to seeing you all next week when those things happen. So without any further ado, we're a little over today. We're going to close out. Make sure that you go out and you vote. The Voter Protection Hotline, 833-VOTE-FLA. Again, that's 833, and of course it goes away. I think it said vote FLA.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you all, and we're out for today. And I appreciate you all for being a part of our audience.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you
you so much.